Wonderful. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Larisa Kurtović, a former colleague of mine at UC Berkeley, and now assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Ottawa. She is a political anthropologist conducting research on activist politics, post-socialist transformation, and the aftermath of international intervention in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her ethnographic analysis of popular mobilizations, political satire, and nationalist politics have appeared on the pages of American Ethnologist, Focal, History and Anthropology, and Critique of Anthropology, among others. She's currently writing a book entitled Future as Predicament, Political Life After Catastrophe, based on her long-term research in post-war Bosnia, as well as working on a future graphic ethnography, really cool, about syndical struggle and political possibilities with anthropologist Drew Gilbert and graphic artist Forrest Stoppage. So with that, please take it away, Larisa.
So thank you, Kevin, so much for that lovely introduction. It reminded me of the fact that Andrew Gilbert, my collaborator, recently explained to me that syndical does not mean the same thing in English as it means in our local languages. So it should actually be union organizing, right? Not the kind of a criminal, enterprise, mob, that type of thing. But on on that note, I'm so pleased to be here and to meet all of you. Kevin, thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this. Let me start by telling you a couple of things. I really look forward to this. When I received the invitation, I thought about what I would like to present, and I decided to go with this excerpt from this book manuscript on which I'm currently working, which is indeed based on this long-term research. So the material that I will be mostly discussing today is from 2008 and 2009. And it's a material that I've been sitting on for quite some time, distracted as I am by multiple ongoing projects. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to workshop. This is how I imagined it, I suppose, this particular section of the book, which I'm trying to rework in particular kinds of ways. So let me add that this is very much a work in progress and that it's a part of a much larger work. And I'm assuming that this audience will not need as much context as some others might. But of course, if anything is confusing and you need clarification, please let me know, and I'm happy to offer that in the Q&A. So I see Drew is here. Hello, I was just mentioning you. And so I will read. This is the Anthropological Convention. You will apologize. You will forgive me for doing so, and I have planned to talk for about 45 minutes. I do have an accompanying PowerPoint, which I'm going to attempt to share right now. So can you confirm that you see it? Okay. And I have now lost, okay. Bring your shared window, okay. Just a second, I'm having some kind of an issue here that I am not. Why does it go on pause? So let me just give me a second to figure out my specific problem here. Okay, can somebody just verbally confirm that they're seeing this?
Yes, it is in full screen.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that, and thank you. It looks, in fact, like I will be able to maybe read from this particular screen. So let me try to, in fact, do that. Okay. So as you see, my talk is called Sarajevo Spring of Discontent, Public Safety, Youth Violence, and the Politics of Answerability in Post-War Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's part of chapter 4 in the book. So here it goes. In late afternoon of February 5th, 2008, a 16-year-old high school honor student, Denis Mrnjavac, was beaten and fatally stabbed by a group of 3 teenagers in a tram traveling through downtown Sarajevo. Mrnjavac was on his way home from school when he encountered a group of 3 rebel rousers who thought he was looking at them funny. Once the passengers entered the train, the 3 boys attacked, beating Mrnjavac with brass knuckles. In the final moments, the youngest one pulled a knife. Even though the tram was full of people, no one among the other riders attempted to stop the attack or apprehend the killers. The driver, realizing something was going on in the back of the tram car, pulled the brake and alerted the police and the paramedics. By then, help came too late. Young Mrnjavac died in the hospital in the early hours of the following day from the wounds he sustained during the shocking attack. Although the police managed to bring the attackers into custody by the end of the night, the event descended upon the city like a shockwave. Mrnjavac's murder, by all accounts random and a product of a banal confrontation, presented the last in a series of particularly gruesome crimes committed by underage offenders that same winter. A few weeks prior to the Mrnjavac tragedy, another underage boy set on fire and killed an old woman, Ljubica Spasojević, allegedly over money owned and some dispute over a musical instrument. Newspaper pages and online forums were flooding with stories about crimes committed by underage offenders, further amplifying the atmosphere of uncertainty and insecurity. Shortly after Mrnjavac died, journalists reporting on these events uncovered that the institutional mechanisms for the prevention and sanction of underage offenders were in such dire state that even convicted juveniles could not be sanctioned for the crimes they committed. Rumors circulated that seasoned felons were recruiting youngsters for their dirty work, exploiting the gaps created by the incomplete post-war legal reforms, whose goal was to separate the criminal from the juvenile systems, as is standard practice in the West. Meanwhile, parents worried about the safety of their own children. Seniors lamented they no longer felt safe leaving their homes after dark. The streets of the city that had only 13 years earlier emerged out of the longest military siege in modern history once again felt treacherous. A few days later, the murdered boys' classmates invited the city's inhabitants to join them in the march of mourners, an emotional gathering that nevertheless gave charge to the political moment. The initial assembly set in motion the largest wave of protests in the city since the anti-war demonstrations of 1992, which emboldened local activists and opposition parties and gratified the domestic and international reformers who had long hoped for such a massive grassroots uprising. The lethargic city sleeping in the mountain-encircled valley, whose residents are said to be more interested in lingering in cafes than fighting for social change, after 13 years of post-war days, had finally revolted. So in today's talk, which is an excerpt from a book on which I'm currently working, I zoom in on these initial post-war protests in order to pursue answers to a series of interrelated questions. How did a tragic and seemingly apolitical act of youth violence bring people into streets in such numbers? What conditions, political, historical, and social, turned juvenile delinquency into a rallying cry? What notions of political responsibility grounded these protests? And what light do these articulations shine on the fragmented, overgoverned, and internationally supervised post-war state? And last, but certainly most importantly for my purposes, how might this mobilization help make sense of futurity as a foundational problem space in post-war Bosnia? Answering these questions requires reconsidering long-standing models of political authority, as well as thinking seriously about what the protesters themselves would come to articulate as the need for odgovornost vlasti, or governmental responsibility. This phrase invokes not only the neoliberal language of accountability, but also a Strathernian critique of audit cultures, a form of late modern governmentality simultaneously rooted in the, quote, methods and precepts of financial accountability and individualizing notions of moral responsibility. Today, I want to push past such usual framings of the term odgovornost, which may be translated as responsibility, accountability, but also answerability, not because they're irrelevant, but because they tell only one part of the story. While the protesters among whom I worked did indeed reach for financial arguments to make claims that political officials were not doing the jobs for which they were paid, more often than that, they invoked the language of shame and pleas for forgiveness in order to index their own attachment to a vision of morality that surpassed financial logics and pointed to a different ways of conceptualizing the social and political altogether. Rooted in the social and political history of Yugoslav socialism, this articulation for grounded moral claims and responsibilities of power to society at large, as it reckoned with the material and the perceived collapse of the biopolitical order, both in its more punitive and more caring forms. What's more, protesters focused on issues of juvenile crime and what is still known as youth delinquency presents a particularly fruitful opportunity to intervene in anthropological debates on late liberalism as a historical and political formation. Youth crime is a complex political issue at any place and time that lays bare longue-durée histories of class and racial formation and its attendant modes of social abandonment and political violence. Indeed, political mobilizations that conceive it as a key threat are typically, though also too easily, read as a form of right-wing populism. However, liberal and socialist parties also take up the issue of youth crime in order to cast it as an effect of broader socioeconomic and political shifts, including unemployment, economic insecurity, lack of opportunities, and discrimination. This is to say that alarmism surrounding juvenile delinquency is also a form of problematization of the future itself, a call to action and reform, which traverses conventional ideological divisions. So, as I make clear in what follows, both of these impulses, one punitive and the other liberal and reformists, were present during the Mrnjavac's protests. Some argued for more policing, more criminalization, and more discipline, directed specifically at juvenile offenders. Others saw the rise of juvenile crime as a signal that society as a whole had failed its youth, and argued for new kinds of opportunities and new kinds of opportunities and political hope were necessary to remedy this problem. Yet, irrespectively of what policies the protesters called for, they saw juvenile crime as a political problem, one that demanded attention from the disorganized, inept, and, as they would soon learn, insolent political authorities. So to argue this, I draw on my long-term fieldwork among some of the most ardent participants of these protests, who in the summer of 2008 decided to form a new organization, Citizen Action, of which I too became an active member, following the tradition of militant ethnography and activist anthropology. But because I commenced my fieldwork less than 2 months after the protests had come to a halt, I rely on interviews with and subsequent ethnographic research among the protesters, the written record of their correspondences, media reports, various protest memorabilia, photographs, and video material. My aim is to provide a thick socio-political context to many of the grievances expressed by them, and to link questions of youth delinquency to the crisis of futurity on the one hand, and the ubiquitous concerns about the disappearance of the state as an orchestrator and nurturer of social life on the other hand. So to that end, let me first trace the chronology of events and work through some of the dominant ways in which these protests had originally been analyzed. Okay. So building the protest movement. Oh, why is it going? Okay. So the chain of protests that took place between February 9th and May 9th surprised most observers as well as many of its participants. It also ushered in a multifaceted political mobilization in which tens of thousands of Sarajevans participated, many of whom came out into the streets for the very first time. When Mrnjavac's classmates invited Sarajevans to express their grief and concern, they brought with them to the protest a large banner asking, "How many more Denises?" They purportedly addressed this question to the local government and its various agencies in charge of public security, including the police and the office of the prosecutor. As the protest moved through the city, the crowd deliberately stopped and chanted in front of the government headquarters, demanding a reaction from the officials. Participants of this first gathering with whom I spoke suggested that the crowd improvise many of its steps that day because it was unsure how to best make use of the assembled body and concentrated affect. While the first march placed bodies on the streets, the complete political escalation did not take place until the second protest on the 15th of February. By then, Sarajevo's residents had more questions for local authorities. In the days following the tragedy, the public learned that the Sarajevo canton no longer had the means of sanctioning violent underage offenders due to a combination of factors, including post-war institutional fragmentation, poorly implemented reforms, and a perpetual lack of funding, experts, and effort. No specialized institutions for juveniles or prisons of the kind that existed in the socialist era functioned since the end of the war. 2 years before the protests, acting under the pressure of the international community, which demanded such reforms as part of the EU accession, the federal parliament passed the document called the Strategy for the Prevention and Sanction of Youth Delinquency. However, by 2008, 2 years later, Sarajevo cantonal government had not yet taken the next step, that is, produced a plan of action. To many, this long delay testified to the nerad, the inaction, insolence, laziness, and lack of sense of duty that pervaded the post-war administration. The cantonal government hoped to rectify this problem and catch up on its long overdue implementation of the strategy during an urgent meeting of the ministerial cabinet solely dedicated to the problem of deteriorating public safety. But the local NGO sector saw this as an opportunity to invite citizens to express their dissatisfaction and moral outrage by protesting in front of the government offices during the officials' meeting. Riding the momentum, a group of several hundred people gathered in front of the building housing cantonal ministries. The incensed protesters, many of them youngsters, proceeded to throw stones, eggs, and fruit on the government building in the midst of the cabinet's meeting, breaking down the windows and damaging the newly renovated pastel facade. The scene culminated in the confrontation between the indignant and up to that point not widely known cantonal prime minister Samir Silajic, I don't think any relation to Haris Silajic, some of you might know him, and Demir Mahmut Çehayic, an activist of the movement Dosta, or Enough, which had invited people to protest that day. As the crowds continued to boo and throw objects, Mahmut Çehayic entered the building in order to reason with the officials inside. He was met with a screaming lecture by the Prime Minister Silajic, who accused the activist of antagonizing the crowd and frightening his young son, who had telephoned his daddy to ask about the ruckus in front of the government headquarters. He also dismissed the activist criticisms by insisting that the local government was full of moral and honest people such as himself, who conducted themselves with dignity and respect. Famously, he said, "Ja vas gledam svijetla obraza," or my cheek and honor are clean. The footage of this screaming match was broadcast on several TV channels, reaching and offending many. Having already grown deeply frustrated with the post-war political establishment, Sarajevans found Silajic's performance repulsive. His affective modality, rage, and contempt for the protesters made him come across as a small-time, paternalistic tyrant, one that would soon learn the pejorative nickname Tayo, or Daddy, which sought to undermine both his parental and political authority. The following day, Silajic used tax revenues, about 2,000, I think, euros, to pay for commercial space in 2 daily newspapers to publish an inflammatory public statement in regards to the stage violence and in front of the headquarters of the canton of Sarajevo. The statement included such rhetorical constructs as, quote, "The events were caused by anti-civilizational and anarchist impulse of the two non-governmental organizations," and, quote, "This morbidly staged uprising against the government and its prime minister tied to the manipulation of children was an effectively planned scenario for the destabilization of the most successful canton and the city of Sarajevo as the capital, initiated and prepared outside of our borders," end quote. The announcement ended with the following statement, quote, "This government comprises honest and moral people whose biographies, property registers, and other private and professional references are matter of public record," end quote. In the months following the protests, the protesters I spoke to often drew their attention to this moment, signaling their profound disgust at how they were addressed by the petty prime minister, who could not even rise to the occasion symbolically and recognize the citizens, just like his own son, were frightened by what Mrnjavac's murder signified. Instead, Sarajević had used public funds to publicly condemn the protesters, calling them a rulja, a mob, and you see it here on this protest sign. Kako ih nije sramota? How are they not ashamed? Asked 49-year-old Iris as we sat together in a cafe in the Dobrinja neighborhood, after she describes to me her own bodily weariness, that something sitting on her chest when she first learned about the murder. A divorced mother of 2 sons separated from an ex-husband who suffered from PTSD, she identified profoundly with Anja Mrnjavac, Denis's mother, who was single parenting following the loss of her husband, who had also been a veteran of the army. Sarajević's crude ideological constructs, which one of my interviewees from a local democracy promotion NGO likened to, quote, "the worst of the socialist era demagogy," end quote, struck these middle-aged women trying to raise families in the post-war city as particularly violent and disrespectful. Being called anti-civilizational anarchists or accused of being a foreign destabilization agent was also quite ironic, given that this segment of the protesters was most ardent in their fetishism of the law and their love of proceduralism, which eventually led them to support the formalization of their activism by founding an Udruženje građana, Citizens Association. Iris also mourned with particular force the passing of the strong police force and the punitive state, a dimension of her politics I would discern much, much later. By contrast, the younger protest participants, many of whom had dabbled in direct action and were looking for an opportunity to come onto the scene as bona fide activists, focused on the productive power of Sarajević's public statement. Then 26-year-old Armin, who in another life was my neighbor and schoolmate, was less preoccupied with youth crime and more with the question of why nothing seemed to be working. Although he too reluctantly joined the new multi-generational activist organization Citizen Action, which his older protest mates wanted, he preferred the more informal organizational structures, having for years worked in a local self-organized charity network called Dobra. Having spent time in the West and working for a major international development organization, he was well versed in the languages of good governance and best practices. As he saw it, the key issue was the impunity and the profound lack of any sense of moral or professional responsibility which permeated the whole society. He knew that many felt the same, and that this moment had the potential to concentrate a multiplicity of grievances and frustrations about the post-war disorder of things. It was this coming to face with the insolent and by all accounts incompetent political order that would eventually lead thousands of Sarajevans to take to the streets for many consecutive Sundays, all the way until the month of May, to peacefully and sometimes very creatively demand first and foremost Sarajević's resignation. Let me show you some of these, just run through them as I speak. Soon after, the protesters began demanding the same for Semiha Borovac, Sarajevo's mayor, who in trying to defend herself for the transgression of having gone shopping in Dubai while the crisis was unfolding, ended up insisting on her womanly, caring instincts towards the city's residents. This gaffe accidentally earned her a pejorative nickname, Mommy, and landed her, together with Sarajević and many other state officials from the ranks of nationalist parties, on a number of protest signs. Caricatural and occasionally grotesque, the protest signs taunted the Sarajević-Borovac stand-in that represented the local government with statements such as, "Daddy, I'm afraid," and "Daddy, who's the criminal here?" I think some of these things are, let me just show them very briefly. So it's a very popular thing. While the kinship metaphors could be linked to officials' own speech, they were meant to mock and shame their addressees, and were meant to mock and shame their addressees. They were also haunted by the post-presence, to borrow the term from Elizabeth Dunn, of the pastoral socialist state that sought to, just like a good parent, shepherd its citizens to a better future. It was painfully clear from these messages that the new post-war state did not quite live up to the expectations of otherwise fully governmentalized subjects who, as they put it on a poster, knew that they deserved better. Let me now tell you a little bit more about them. So this is Građani, new political subjects. Many observers interpreted this series of protests that followed February 15th debacle in front of the cantonal government as the much needed Bosnian Spring. During one of my field interviews, the director of a major international funding agency in Sarajevo offered that after years of the international community's unsuccessful attempts to mold an active citizenry, the birth of the authentic civil society had somehow taken place almost entirely on its own. As an anthropologist, I too was quickly enchanted by the distinctly local energy of the protests, which I began observing from afar as I prepared for my qualifying exams and for departure for some 18 months of fieldwork. But what appeared to be an authentic grassroots mobilization stemming from a unified political front, in the accounts of my informants and my subsequent research, emerged as a series of complex power struggles and chaotic negotiations. The organizations from the formal NGO sector that called for the February 15 protest that led to the damage of the cantonal headquarters soon backed off under threat of sanction, and quickly after lost their legitimacy as the protesters' representatives. Instead, a motley crew of new people emerged to lead the protests, many of them mobilized via the popular Sarajevo X online discussion forums, where much of the organizing was transferred. Particularly important was the newly forged blogging community, which became ground zero of pungent political critique and organizing effort. One of the people who soon emerged as a key voice, let me try to find that slide, was then 45-year-old Flamenco, whom I first met in early June of 2008, when I showed up with a small memorial marking the 5 months of Mrnjavac's slaying. As journalists flocked to a charismatic man, I realized that this was the same guy who had been profiled in a local magazine, Start, along with my aforementioned neighbor Armin, in a moment when citizens of Sarajevo, Građani Sarajeva, were trying to come out of their seeming homogeneity and anonymity, and therefore decided that some of them would make their identities public. Thanks to his penchant for showmanship, he would often serve as an MC at the protests, which he always attended in the company of his 12-year-old son, the parenting of whom he took extremely seriously. Flamenco was a twice wounded veteran of the Bosnian army, who nevertheless avoided formal veterans associations, which were hardline supporters of nationalist parties and openly opposed the protesters as agents of destabilization. After the war, Flamenco got an administrative job at the US Embassy, which meant he was financially independent from the typical clientelist arrangements tied to nationalist parties that dominated much of the public and private sector in the city. And therefore, he was able to step into the limelight without fears of sanction. Conversely, his employment also fed enduring rumors that he was a spy in the activist ranks, I guess just like myself. Along with Flamenco, at that tram station, I met the core group of others who had attended every protest. Some, like 46-year-old Yasmina, later confessed to me that she actually meant to join a different demonstration on February 9th, protesting the lack of reliable transportation between the center city and the peripheral neighborhood of Dobrnja. But she soon realized that her everyday problems as a commuter were not unrelated to the nedostatak sistema, the lack of system, which the Mrnjavac protests laid bare. These new actors of quite varied ethnic, professional, and generational backgrounds began to call themselves simply citizens, građani, seeking to differentiate their position from that of the formal NGO sector, which had long suffered the problems of illegitimacy due to the public's impression it was populated by various entrepreneurial characters whose main motivation was personal enrichment through donor funds rather than social change. Even though these donor funds did eventually arrive on the scene, as international democracy promoters grew more eager to support these grassroots efforts, much of the everyday cost, including printing of flyers and protest materials, were simply bankrolled by donations in cash and kind by participants and their supporters. Use of discussion forums, blogging platforms, and emerging social media proved crucial. But the extensive use of online media was not the only way the protesters were raising the stakes of the political game. While focusing on the crumbling justice system and the responsibility of appointed and elected officials, they diagnosed this crisis of the national future in terms of a new set of political criteria, which had little to do with the quote-unquote big matters of constitutional reform, disagreements between nationalist elites, or identity politics. In the eyes of these protesters, the problem rendered visible by the 2008 wave of violent murders had a distinctly social character and presented itself as a failure of governance rather than a crise of last, rather than the rise of interethnic tension. What makes these moves even more important is the fact that the events that served as the catalyst for civic protests could have easily been folded into narratives of ethnic persecution. For example, Croatian TV station Nova, which also broadcast in Bosnia, attempted to do this by proposing Mrnjavac's murder was an anti-Croat hate crime, an allegation quickly dismissed by the family, the police, the principal of the Catholic high school, and the protesters who quickly learned that Mrnjavac's late father was in fact a Bosniak. The fact this family had known so much tragedy and that Mrnjavac was a child of mixed marriages, of a mixed marriage, a category of special moral and political significance in post-war Bosnia, ravaged by nationalist conflicts and rhetoric, only served to bolster the protesters' moral resolve. What's more, the 2008 wave of violence had no clear nationalist arc. While no one denied that the aforementioned murdered woman, Ljubica Spasojević, was a Serb, the media paid surprisingly little attention to the fact her attacker was a Roma kid. Angered Sarajevans with whom I spoke simply called Robert M. a delinquent and a monster, rarely, if ever, mobilizing the ample ethnic stereotypes about the Roma minority. Instead, this was an equal opportunity demonization directed at young delinquents, their failing parents, and the incompetent state. In fact, there was little sympathy for the predicaments and needs of underage boys living in social and economic marginality. Iris was particularly adamant about this, commenting to me once that these boys and any like them ought to be locked up. When I offered that they too were children of the post-war and post-socialist transition, she responded with frustration. Well, so are mine. How come they're not running around killing people? Iris and many protesters like her saw the solution to the problem in creating more effective mechanisms of sanction. In August of next year, when another young man by the name of Amar Mistric was shot and killed after refusing to serve another round of drinks after closing time, a middle-aged Sarajevan woman was captured by TV cameras exclaiming, "Lijepi Titin Pendrek," oh, the beautiful police baton of Tito. Iris and this fellow Sarajevan woman invoked the specter of the strong disciplinary Yugoslav state, which ruthlessly punished criminals, and contrasted that image with that of the post-war authorities, which were not only criminal in and of themselves, but also deeply incompetent and perhaps compromised by the liberal reforms mandated by the international community. I encountered this genre of criticism quite often during my fieldwork. One time I went out for coffee with one of my old teachers with whom I stayed in touch, only to have her scold me for not being careful enough with my handbag. She proceeded to tell me how times are different now and how police is no longer able to beat criminals senseless. The absence of the physical material measures of sanction compounded the sense that there was no longer a system in place. As a diasporan who had partly grown up in Chicago, a city made infamous by racialized poverty and violence, and as a grad student versed in critical theories of securitization and criminalization, At first, I found these arguments troubling, all the more because they were articulated by people whose cause I had joined and whom I was starting to love. Over time, however, I also grew cognizant that these arguments were attempts to reckon with the pervasive sense of security, insecurity, and vulnerability, which had now found its embodied form in the violent youth offender. The bleak new post-war reality in which their children could be victims of a crime, in addition to not having any guaranteed future prospects, was particularly unsettling to my middle-aged interlocutors who had grown up during the socialist era in a safe and relatively comfortable mid-sized city, where the future to come was one of constant upward mobility and collective betterment. Many of them came from working and middle-class families that reaped the benefits of state-subsidized education and housing policies. The life they had lived disappeared traumatically and seemingly overnight with the start of the nearly four-year-long siege of Sarajevo. In their imagination, the end of the war ought to have returned them to their normal middle-class lives, in which they could feel secure once again in multiple senses. But even in 2008, a moment that in retrospect seemed full of possibility, despair was slowly kicking in. So the next section is called The Future in Crisis: Youth Violence, Middle-Class Security, and Good Governance. The end of the war in Bosnia gave birth to a new logic of political docility, predicated on the idea that all is good while no one's shooting. Sve je dobro dok se ne puca. Eventually, this sense of shock gave way to a profound disillusionment and a slow recognition that nothing, in fact, was going back to normal. Withdrawal and absenteeism was further fueled both by a recognized absence of a viable alternative and the desire to preserve one's health and self from being colonized by 2 decades of political upheaval and hopelessness. But when children and the elderly became victims of gruesome crimes, this logic lost much of its potency, at least among some, especially the re-traumatized parents who were among the first to join the protests. The grievances Sarajevans had accumulated against the post-war government over the previous 12 years, but learned to navigate and survive, surpassed the tolerable threshold once the threat to bodily safety materialized in the figure of the unscrupulous young delinquent whose imagined moral deficit was only proportional to his economic marginality and chaotic socialization amidst widespread institutional and social ruin. In this case, the problem was not simply the degradation of the state's monopoly over violence. Equally pressing were anxieties about the capacity of the state to provide necessary modes of discipline in the dual Foucauldian sense, as pedagogy and punishment. The moving target of this failed post-disciplinary state was youth. The events of February 2008 undoubtedly framed youth as the population that best exemplified widespread anxieties about uncertain national futures. They also produced it anew as a category that was at once a potential source of risk, but also in dire need of guidance and investment. So unsurprisingly, and let me find these images, here you go. Many young people participated in the protests, despite the fact that as a group, they had long become synonymous with voter absenteeism and disillusionment with post-war nationalist politics. This time, they marched side by side with adults, sometimes carrying banners with cynical messages such as, "We don't need anything, everything has already been promised to us," or "Ništa nam ne treba, sve nam je obećano." During one of the protests, 2 young boys were photographed carrying a sign that said, "Tito did not hide from youth, Tito se nije krio od omladine," a message that was probably composed by their parents, since their own lived experience did not include the late Yugoslav president. Yet the contrast between then and now could still be mobilized as a powerful mode of critique against the post-war politicians who, simply put, did not measure up to the, if not quite radiant past, than one that was at least more livable. And let me say that Tito's photographs featured prominently during these protests. Youth represented the segment of population that during socialism had been the target of significant political and social intervention by the Yugoslav state. Young people's political and moral subjectivities were molded from the early stages of their lives through membership in societies such as the Young Pioneers, Tito's Youth, or Omladinci, and volunteer activities such as youth work actions and brigades. During late socialism, however, the public view of youth became darker and more sinister, as experts and government officials worried about the rise of unemployment, drug addiction, social delinquency, nationalism, political radicalism, and violent crime, and how these things were affecting, and arguing that this segment was affected, of the population was affected by these things more than others. Through the 1980s, the Yugoslav sociologists produced a series of studies and polemics, contributing to the growing genre of what I'm calling society in crisis literature. They decried the problem of youth delinquency and other signs of social and moral degradation of their country. Several studies done in this period inquired into the rising significance of nationalism among youth, and particularly later into the links between certain forms of peacetime violence and dissent, such as football fan clubs and their hooligans, and parliamentary mobilizations and paramilitary mobilizations in Serbia specifically, and I'm thinking here of Čović's work. Violence perpetrated against and by youth, that is by 18-year-olds enlisted in armies and paramilitaries, became an ordinary part of wartime landscape. While the not so distant experiences of the 1992 through 96 siege tacitly propelled this crisis imaginary, the widely deployed narratives of comparison came from socialist period that offered the real contrast with the broken promises of post-war life. The frequently cited line, quote, "Before the war, you could fall asleep on a park bench and no one would touch you," perhaps best exemplified this tendency. For most, such narratives illustrated both the favorable societal conditions and the successful politics of distribution in socialist Yugoslavia, which supposedly made violent and economic crimes infrequent. This is why Mrnjavac's tragedy, why Mrnjavac's tragic passing served as such a powerful catalyst, because the victim was an exemplary student, a handsome kid, and the only child of a widowed mother. His murder struck a chord with middle-class parents already deeply worried about the existential fate of their children in a moment defined by chronic and multifaceted social, political, and economic crisis. These middle-class anxieties translated into the very composition of the body of protesters that took to the streets. Although the socioeconomic backgrounds of the protesters varied, the most vocal participants and the majority of emerging leaders belonged to an urban elite with secure jobs and significant amounts of social and cultural capital. In short, the people on the streets did not necessarily belong to the dispossessed lumpen proletariat, stripped naked in the process of post-war primitive accumulation. Many of them had never done a political act of such order before that moment. But one thing that did unite many of them was the fact that they were parents trying to raise children in an increasingly difficult situation, and in some cases, amidst bona fide familial tragedies. Despite her aforementioned bravado and insistence that delinquent youth with irresponsible parents needed to be sanctioned, Iris was far from confident in her own capacities to raise her kids. In 2009, her youngest son almost gave her an ulcer when he failed to get into a four-year-long high school that would offer him the possibility of someday going to college. She mobilized all her social capital in sight, courting his grade school teachers, friends, and acquaintances who worked in the sector of education, and her numerous other connections to help him get on the list for the second round of high school entrance exams. Eventually, he got into a better school, only to flunk 14 out of 15 subjects in his first year because he did not do any studying at all. Iris attended parent-teacher conferences and tried all means of subtle and overt persuasion. She was grateful for the fact her son did not have any other problems and was otherwise well-behaved, courteous, and kind. But her heart broke when he told her he did not see the point of studying, when he would not have a future, since he lived in a country where no one accomplished anything through honesty and hard work. "What am I supposed to say to that?" she asked. Edith was not the only one haunted by the question of what kind of society her sons were growing up in and what this meant for her as a parent. The same was the case with Plamenko, for whom the murder of Denis Mrnjavac violently evoked his desire to take part in some form of political action. In the interview for the news magazine and our subsequent conversations, Plamenko admitted, quote, "I went out into the streets out of fear. Important things have happened in this city during my life, and I participated in them. After that, I became afraid that I would be remembered as a part of that generation that is identified by the phrase, keep quiet, all is good until they begin shooting." The day Denis died, a switch went off. Ja sam bukvalno prevrnut. After the war, I had the parking brake on. In February, I decided my fear had come to an end. The type of fear Plamenko described had nothing to do with anxieties about potential retribution or intimidation by nationalist parties or some other agent of the underground loyal to them. And I want to insist some protesters did experience this. The fear about which he spoke belonged to an entirely different register. During one of our conversations in the summer of 2008, Plamenko described to me his return home from work on the day that Denis Mrnjavac passed. The news pushed him into hours-long paralysis, out of which he was catapulted by the sound of fireworks. The fireworks had been arranged in the honor of the anniversary of the opening of the annual festival of Sarajevo winter, traditionally held in February to commemorate the 1984 Sarajevo Winter Olympics. Describing his outrage at the level of alienation, he said, otuđenje, in Bosnian society, and at the people who did not see it fit to postpone the celebration because a kid had just died in the most gruesome of ways, he exclaimed, right there, I imploded. Ja sam tu pukao. At first, I thought Plamenko's story of visceral crisis was solely related to the embodied frustrations with the kind of world he was living in and in which he was raising his son. But as I got to know him better, I also started hearing rumors that he too had lost a child, although it would take years of friendship and him reading an earlier draft of this analysis in order to talk about what had happened. The enormity of this loss, about which I promise not to write in great detail, made the Mrnjavac tragedy personal, and his understanding of parental and political responsibility in turn, profound and anti-procedural. I found his recourse to the language of alienation quite important, for it focused on the fissure between what was and what he thought ought to be. The absence of moral consciousness, exemplified in the celebration and in the subsequent words and behaviors of local officials, signified something far deeper was broken and missing. What Plamenko and his fellow protesters wanted was not simply an efficient, accountable administration, but also the kind of government that felt a sense of moral obligation to the people it governed. Such a government would have had the capacity to recognize it was of and for the people, and sought to act in the public's best interests. Scholars of other political worlds where the state has historically acted as a vehicle of oppression or spectral abandonment might find this conceptualization of state authority quaint and naive. But such visions are articulated by people whose subjectivities were shaped by a regime of social governance that explicitly promised and often delivered vast improvements in lives of everyday people who by and large came to identify with it. These were, to contrast my argument with that of Larisa Stevenson, fully governmentalized subjects who bought into the idea that government cared and that biopolitical governance was a public good. Such a model of political authority rested on a humanist conception of social relationality that obligates the government to answer to life. This was, to invoke Bakhtinian terminology, a call to an answerable politics, a political ethical frame that certainly foregrounded care, but also rested on liability to blame and the capacity to feel shame. Protesters were therefore shocked that the state authorities manifested so little shame over the failures of the post-war state to maintain social discipline and guarantee public safety. It was precisely this lack of disciplinary institutions that made the resumptions of both normal life and social reproduction impossible. Some of them, like Flamenco, were also personally ashamed they had let it happen by consenting to the post-war status quo. This mode of affect stemmed from a deep sense of post-war malaise. The preoccupations of citizens with issues of public safety suggest declining confidence in the ability of the Bosnian state to retain the monopoly over the use of violence and regulate crime. In such a frame, what seems to be at stake is a particular sort of crisis of sovereignty, which is haunted by the memory of the conditions under which this new state was born. In addition to recruiting ordinary civilians, Bosniak nationalist leadership mobilized during the war the help of street gangs, petty criminals, and serious mafia to help with the defense of the besieged city. This devil's bargain brought into close proximity and near symbiotic relationship this post-war political oligarchy and the criminal underground, which on occasions shows its ugly face through different scandals. The public's impression of the compromised security situation corresponded to this anxiety about the corruption, criminality, and violence as being embedded into the very fabric of the new post-war order. In fact, over time, this became more and more apparent as Bosnian citizens calling for the state to materialize and do its job slowly began coming into a realization that this new post-war state not only had little interest in bettering their lives and securing their children's future, but was actually, as Azra Hamajic and I have argued elsewhere, a cannibalistic one. So when the protesters returned to the streets in 2013, they were protesting the paralysis of governance stemming from nationalist bickering, which left newly born babies unregistered and without documents. Some of these children who needed to travel abroad for life-saving medical care could not do so because they could not be issued passports. In what became known as the babylution or bebelucija, citizens once again came into the streets to save the future and demand a different kind of a state. But in the years to come, through movements like Pravda za Davida and Pravda za Dženana, both of which are ongoing in the cities of Banja Luka and Sarajevo, the public also came face to face with another realization, that this post-war state was not only neglectful and disinterested, but sometimes actually openly murderous. Both David and Dženan were killed under mysterious circumstances, and in both cases, families suspected police participated in massive cover-ups. In both cases, parents stepped out to lead the movements, often at tremendous personal cost. This is to say that the crisis of futurity is more than a mere abstraction, but something pervasive and material, embodied in the figures of these murdered young men, whose memory is actually haunted by the memory of many others that perish in the wars of the so-called Yugoslav succession. The loss of their lives and the future potential their lives signified is not only compounded by the losses represented today by the mass departures of the young in search of work and better futures elsewhere. One might say that the mobilizations of 2008 were the avatar of these new forms of abandonment that are making more desirable futures increasingly unimaginable within the confines of this post-war and post-intervention state. And on that lovely, depressing note, I will end here. So let me stop sharing because I can't see anybody. Thank you for listening. I know that was a lot.
Thank you so much, Larisa. And thank you for demonstrating that while anthropologists may read more often when they present, it's often beautifully written and engaging. So with
that's our bargain, right? Yes.
Devil's bargain, exactly. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. We have quite a lot of people. I think I can see everyone on one screen. Oh, I can. So if you just want to put your hand up or signal otherwise that you have a question, I can call on you. Who would like to start?
I would love both questions and comments and any feedback. So.
We have a brave soul here.
I knew Drew was gonna go for it. Go.
I was waiting. I don't want to go first, but I mean, it's kind of silly. But anyway, I'll step into the breach. I really love hearing this material afresh from the perspective of kind of now, on the other side of research that I've also done on more recent protests, and Larisa and I have worked on that together, although haven't seen this material in those terms. And it just got me thinking about demand-based politics in a kind of state society, and how a demand-based politics, in other words, demands usually of the government to act in a certain kind of way, are kind of based upon some notion of a social contract, right? Like, you know, each there's a role on each side to play, and we give you whatever legitimacy, and then you provide what you're supposed to do. And what was fascinating to me is we've done research on that vis-a-vis workers. Workers make demands on the state in towards certain ways. And what has always struck me about when workers do it is that they regularly fail. I mean, the state never responds. But in publicly getting no response, they animate the actions of others in the society for support, right? So there's this kind of interesting performance of, we make demands publicly, they are publicly kind of rejected, but that kind of animates others to help. And it makes me think that, or wonder whether something similar is going on here, right? That a kind of public demand, especially in the name of, or as parents, and the failure to get a response, probably even stronger than workers, animates then other kinds of people. And so I guess the first thing I was just maybe going to suggest or ask you to comment more on is how important is that kind of that role of parent that gives people a voice to speak legitimately on the question of futurity, because it strikes me that social reproduction and expectations are one way to stabilize the experience of time, and the fact that especially, I think one of the reasons you see big booms in natality, so births, during and after war, is this sense of instability that the war causes, and that by having children, you are attempting to restabilize the experience of time through a certain kind of life course. And the failure
Except that this
here.
didn't happen in Bosnia, right?
Well, yeah. I don't know.
I mean, a little bit of a baby,
a little bit, yeah.
You know, and
A little bit.
Months, but
and
little. Lisa has written about this. Like, there was a tiny little, but then like it all went to hell.
So anyway, I'm just wondering if there's something there, especially about the kind of the role as parent, and maybe even kind of doubling down in your argument about thinking about how that gives people a purchase, both on the attention of the public, but also the legitimacy of a voice when it comes to national politics of the future. And that even when ignored will animate others because of the moral righteousness of that legitimate claim.
So I heard two questions, and let me kind of parse them out. And the first question is about this demand-based politics that is not met adequately, but then nevertheless ends up kind of cascading into a series of effects that have other kinds of political purchase. And I think, to really, the way that I tell the story, and I'm loath to give so much space to Sarajevans, who is kind of resigned, some months after the protests, and has since sort of been not heard of. He's kind of withdrawn into the interstices of the post-war state. Is the importance that my interlocutors actually gave to this scandalous kind of response. So it's not that the citizens did not receive a response. They got a scolding, and a scolding that was so offensive because in part of its overblown, you know, kind of ideologically very crude rhetoric that revealed him not only as this kind of like petty tyrant, but also somebody who had no idea, you know, was so disconnected from the reality of people's lives and who they were, that, you know, he became the kind of perfect embodiment of this insolent new post-war authority that, you know, was very violent in its incompetence as well. And I think that a lot of people really, you know, because my informants, and I go into this in other parts, really thought that, okay, fine, you know, constitutional reform, Dayton state, fragmented, fucked up, but why do things not work in the canton of Sarajevo? Like literally, like, you know, why are there issues here where, you know, it's a kind of a majority, you know, constellation of these kind of Bosniak and social democratic parties? Why do basic things not seem to work, such as, for example, public transit, which is something that Stevenson also talks about, you know, the Dublin frustrations with being cut off from the city and so forth. So this was a kind of, you know, these were minimalist demands, and yet they were met, you know, and this kind of fetishism of this strategy for the prevention and sanction of youth delinquency, as if this was going to like solve something. But you know, it was significant, obviously, that this had not been passed, that nobody had done anything for 2 years. And this confirmed citizens' suspicions about, you know, exactly the kind of responsibility and the kinds of negligence that was populating the ranks of this new post-war administration. And, you know, these are people who, many of them professionals, you know, highly educated, working in very serious jobs, who just couldn't understand why things weren't working. And so it's a very specific kind of a segment. And then, you know, the other part of it being this, you know, being haunted by the trauma of the war and the desire for some kind of a normalcy and predictability of social life that the state could not guarantee, that wasn't interested in guaranteeing anymore. So that, I think, is the first part that kind of encountered the coming into realization of what this new configuration was. And I think it took the protesters a minute to realize that this was a different type of a thing. And but the other part that you're asking me about is sort of thinking about parenting and futurity, right? I have to say that I didn't really anticipate this when I first set out to do this research. I knew that I was interested in futures, and when I was a graduate student, there's a particularly kind of sort of an emergent conversation on hope, if you will recall, because you've written about this as well, which kind of fizzled out, you know, and didn't go to so many, you know, it didn't deliver in its promises, if you will. But I was constantly kind of trying to figure out how to ground something as potentially abstract as futurity in something really, really concrete. And in that sense, I had the great ethnographic fortune to land in this, amidst this group of ethnographic interlocutors who were, you know, articulating both in tacit and overt ways that part of what was animating their political engagement was really a sense of responsibility to the future, but not some kind of an abstract future, but the future of their children. And I remember going to one of these very early organizing meetings, like there was a process through which citizen action was founded and registered as a civic association. And I remember meeting one of the protesters who was there, and, you know, he kind of later disappeared. Didn't really pursue this, but he said something at the end which has haunted me to this day. He said, you know, do you think I'm doing this because I think I'm going to change something? And he started to kind of laugh cynically. You know, I'm doing this because one day when my kid asks me, why is everything so screwed up? You know, I'm going to be able to say that I tried. And so this was a kind of a beautiful kind of statement about a sense of moral responsibility, and, you know, and like one that fully anticipated failure, or something else that I write about in this manuscript, but that nevertheless really valorized intentionality and commitment and you sort of that type of political subjectivity that did not consent, right, to the state of things, even if it fully understood that change was unlikely to happen. So this is a kind of a deep thing for me. It's pervasive. Like the previous chapter is about the ban on Deda Mraz, right, the socialist Santa in public kindergartens. Other protests about which I have written. I've written about Revolucija. We've written about the 2014 protest. There's always, I haven't really kind of drew the line. I haven't really explored ethnographically Pravda za Davida or Pravda za Džanana. I mean, but I have written about some other, like the Mrnjavac, which is very important to the book as well. So what I find really striking is that the trigger, for every major mobilization, and I will actually add the 2014 mobilization to that as well, always had to do with children. And that nothing else has really had that kind of, even though there's so many reasons to be in opposition to the current regime, it was always the children, either the murdered victims, or the children who had died under these mysterious circumstances and might have been killed by the police, and those who police was protecting. I find that very, very important as a kind of a way of understanding the kind of central question of what's going on in Bosnia. And one of the things that I was kind of thinking about at the very beginning of this project is, so everyone complains, but people so rarely do anything about it, so what actually motivates people to come out and to try. And so this is what I came up with in a kind of an ethnographic sense. And in 2014, I find it interesting that, we know both in Tuzla and Sarajevo, the brutal kind of police repression of the youth really kind of galvanized the cause. In Sarajevo in particular, I mean, with the tourists, and you've written obviously about Tuzla, but in Sarajevo, I think the fact that the young delinquents who had set on fire all these government buildings in 2014, were actually locked up, then a bunch of middle-aged protesters marched over there to the MUP, and demanded that they be released. Which is also very interesting, right? Because it shows that I've spent a lot of time talking about this kind of punitive fetishism of the strong state, the kind of desire for policing and so forth, which I think has a particular saliency. But there's this other part as well, which is that these are children, and that we have failed them somehow, and so that reformist impulse is there. So I find this very, how shall I say, thick, and interesting because of its thickness, and then combined with a kind of that political history that of socialism that deeply valorized youth and invested all kinds of things in it. And I find it very interesting as well that I think I lost this, but one of the protest signs was Računajte na nas, which also is Balashevic's song, about the kind of a generational predicament, very kind of Benjaminian, what is it, the every generation kind of inherits, the I can't recall the exact quote, right? But this sense of the magical kind of relationship between the generation and the cost of the past that cannot be settled cheaply. So I'll end there. Thank you. I mean, I hope that the kind of, I see a lot of work on futurity that I think is really interesting. But it's not always ethnographically grounded, so it's one of the things that I'm really kind of hoping that, this work will accomplish.
Thank you very much. Can we go to the next question?
Please.
All right.
Bunch of people have other Zoom meetings. Thank you for being here. It's rough to be on Zoom all day.
I don't see any hands coming forward, so
Larisa, there she is.
about
You can always rely on the profs. Yes.
That's all I am these days. I don't do my own research.
Well, didn't you just come back from the field?
I did, and
Alyssa, you're going to have to lower your microphone.
Yes.
I had this problem last time, didn't I? Sorry. Yeah, that's why Kevin knows. That,
Yes.
Sorry, you can hear me now.
I could hear you even before that, but go ahead.
Sorry, absent-minded prof. Anyway, I don't have a question, but I would like to just share a couple of, just what I've been thinking through, because I find really interesting as you're talking, a lot of threads that, attitudes or things that people said about the police and lamenting that they don't have this power anymore, that I found when I was looking at the police in Zenica, and their newly found, actually they were suddenly much more powerful in terms of prosecuting domestic violence, for example. But this was not the thing that people were lamenting, right? They were, looking at
ironic.
real criminals. Right, exactly. It was the huge irony there. But I've been thinking, of course, about the most recent research that I've been doing in Bihać and Unsko-Sanski Canton with the migration crisis, and trying to think through, this relationship to complaints against different levels of government, because of course there's not the same complaint about betrayal by our government. Some people do have those complaints, but it's mostly directed at Sarajevo, right? These are the people who are betraying their charge or their obligations towards us as citizens. But what really also struck me just now was what you were saying about children, because of course the police in Unski-Sanski Canton and the Croatian police are beating the shit out of young men, children. But these are migrants, and they're seen as, by many people,
external to the social body.
Exactly. Racialized, external. They're seen as criminals and threats. But there are some people who don't see them this way, who want to help them, and they very often express this in terms of, these are someone's children.
I've noticed that from all the Facebook groups I follow, it's typically pious Muslim women who have this kind of configuration.
Yeah, but also just ordinary citizens who don't post on Facebook, who aren't they just sort of adopt. My neighbors did this. They just adopted this small group of Pakistani kids. They were like 19, 20 years old, and this is how they talked about, like, they're far away from their parents, or they lost their parents. These are some, I would adopt them if I weren't so old, kind of things like this, these expressions of care. Anyway, I just wanted to
kin making.
Yeah. So, I really, the day when I actually start writing this, I really want to pick up on these threads that come out of these different episodes, right, in the post-war period. Not just from my earlier research, and then yours and Azra's and Drew's. It all is accumulating, especially for, obviously, this is what the people that you're talking to are also saying in terms of accumulating experience and histories from before the war as well, in that relationship. So anyway, thanks. It's good to think with.
I think, thank you so much for the comments. It's actually really generative, and I was wondering what kind of a connection was going to be made between the violence of policing borders and what I'm talking about, right? From way back, because obviously this question then of where, like, what purpose does the police baton serve? In these moments is a very, very kind of a powerful one. And I find it interesting as well that you are finding in your own ethnographic research that there is this, like, there are these arguments out there that are, on the one hand, about sanction and kind of repression, but on the other hand, they're also about care. And and that they can coexist in a similar political moment, that they have this continuity and this history And that, you know, sometimes they'll be actually invoked by different people in different times. Like there is a kind of a slippage, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think about this, I mean, quite a bit because of this question, you know, like coming into realization as somebody who has lived, for example, in the United States, right? That people, that they're historically said that the historically sedimented types of relationship to political authority are quite different, spatially speaking, right? And so that's this kind of identification with the system that I see among many of my interlocutors in Bosnia. Like you don't necessarily see this in the United States in the similar kinds of ways, especially among, you know, groups that are racialized, right? That have, you know, that have experienced the state as a machine for producing violence, right? And so what does it mean then to be a part of, embedded or like in the belly of the beast, and to actually believe, you know, that biopolitical care is a good, you know, like, and not a kind of not another kind of form of repression. And, you know, we can think about all the anthropological critiques of the medical establishment, the kind of, you know, the various forms of knowledge and discipline that emerged out of kind of an attempt to create a modern governance, and how, you know, in a place like Bosnia, there's so many people that are still, and including myself, I catch myself thinking this all the time, how perhaps the best thing that we could have come up with was the biopolitical state and the welfare state, and where the hell is it, right? You know, and so I you know, this kind of desire to be the governed subject is a very interesting one to me, especially in the midst of this current political moment. And obviously, like this question also, what does this kind of an argument do in the era of defund police, and, you know, in amidst the resurgence of Black Lives Matter mobilizing, right, which is precisely against this kind of policing and against this kind of social control that, you know, I should say has a very different history in a place like United States or Canada.
Right.
But nevertheless, like one has to think about these things.
Yeah, okay, so many things, but one is that the people in Bosnia don't seem to notice. I mean, there are a couple of activists who are trying to call people's attention to this, but it doesn't get picked up, that they don't seem to notice that a lot of the international money that's coming for the support of migrants is actually going to the militarization of the police force and border police. And
that will come to bite them.
And they keep warning, like, this is going to be used against us. Look, it was already in 2014 and whenever the protests were.
2014.
Yeah. And it's going to, you know, this is we should be paying attention to this, but people are of course, you know, looking towards how to solve the migrant crisis. What I also wanted to say was, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about this, you know, the idea of care can also be directed towards the care of one's own people against, you know, those other threats and whatever. I mean, we have students working on that in some context of like right-wing nationalist movements in Hungary, for example, working to keep out foreigners and non-Hungarians and non-Christians and non-whites and that kind of thing. But what I originally wanted to say was that you got me thinking about looking at what's going on right now in Sarajevo with the migrant crisis, because there was a killing recently, again, of a young man. These are all young men. I can't think of an instance where a young woman was killed, but it invokes a certain sort of lost potential for the sort of the future of families in terms of carrying names and this kind of
social reproduction, right?
I wonder how much you've thought through the gendered.
Well, I don't know if you had a chance to read our Polar Forum, but I did as much, I think, you know. I did make that argument. So there is a Polar Forum. Maybe Drew can share the links in the chat as I'm dealing with this, but that we've just recently done on protest and generations in honor initially. You know, Natasha Humphreys' article that came out in Polar, which is about 2014 protests in Sarajevo, and like middle-aged protesters and youth, so it's a kind of an like a different moment, and she was there during these protests, right? And then some other work that we had been doing, obviously in Tuzla, and then there's another article that just came out on that, but slightly different, doesn't really thematize the generation so much. But obviously Azar Hramajic, who has written about the integrated high school in Mostar, was one of the participants in Drew, who he himself has written about hooligan, like the kind of football fans and their role, and in the uprising in Tuzla in particular. So we were kind of like sensitized around these issues, of course, but none of us. I mean, I'm deliberately staying out of the migrant crisis. I find it unbearable, and it's just not. I was staying out of kind of writing about it in any kind of a direct way.
Yeah, there's no reason why you should. It's just it's something.
Oh no, I don't think that I should. I'm saying like it's a deliberate choice on my end, because I think there's something that, like, having been a humanitarian subject before, like I respond viscerally to this, and the violence of the humanitarian care is pretty clear to me, and that's like the better side. The other is
right. No, but I think it brings out a lot of continuities and slight shifts in some of the same things that you're talking about. And I was just pointing to looking at it in the Sarajevo area, because a lot of these things have been sort of coming to a head and repeating the patterns of Bihać.
I think this is like, when anthropologists think about political subjectivity, this is exactly the things that we should be paying attention to, like, continuities such as this, and their slight shifts and reiterations, and like their histories. And if we want to understand, both demand and non-demand based politics, I think that these are the things that we have to attend to. So I'm sure that I'm also grateful to know that these things still resonate, given the fact that I am so late in getting this out. But
come on, look who you're talking to. Those of us whose books
we are slow.
Far later than
we are slow. It's definitely
let me just point out that on the back of my book they put anthropology, gender studies, history.
That's rough. I wouldn't actually mind that. I wouldn't mind that. I see myself as a kind of a historical and a political anthropologist for sure. I think that there is like maybe comments or questions in the chat. Kevin, should we attend to those?
Oh, there's a question from Amina in the chat. Amina, would you like to read it, or should I go ahead? I'll just go ahead then. So Amina notes that she had been following the protests in Tuzla and Sarajevo. However, at the end, it was discovered that some of the mobilization had actually come from above, from the political elites, as a kind of tripping. Have you done any research on this, and how these influences work and how young people reacted to this?
So this was the famous theory that Fahri Radončić and the Stranka za bolju budućnost, which, I mean, it's kind of ironic. The irony is not lost on me that this was the name of the party, that they had actually orchestrated and organized, the protests. And Drew can also speak to this. We definitely had heard, from our long-term interlocutors in Tuzla who were on the ground of the first protests, and also in February of 2014, that there were things there that suggested that there was a kind of an organized, effort, that they were like kind of, the people who came were not from Tuzla, and there were all kinds of confusions about what was going on. But I'm going to kind of reiterate the claim that I actually made in like an op-ed that I wrote, like as these protests were unfolding. And because I had said, like, if this is true, right? I mean, I had acknowledged that it was a possibility even before like more evidence had come in. And there was like an expose by a bodyguard of Fahri Radončić, who I think, claimed that this was orchestrated and so forth. It's kind of one of these like yellow press type of things, but, probably some truth to it, that, it really doesn't matter, right? Because, you know, for a mobilization to take off, you know, to land in such a way and to produce these kinds of effects, there had to be other things going on, and that there had to be, you know, the ground had to be fertile, right, for these seeds to actually sprout. And I'm personally more interested in that, because I find also, you know, because these protests in 2008, you know, sure, they were supported by the opposition parties like SDP, Social Democratic Party, and then like out of these protests, another thing happened, which is that Naša stranka was founded. This was coterminous events, right? So the opposition, these were definitely opposition protests. Most people who came out in the streets were not supporters of the nationalist parties in the city. So this definitely, I mean, there was a political element to that, but also like that's such a small, tiny fraction of the story that was happening, right? And the fact that, you know, so many, the way that people talk about politics in Bosnia always has to take the form of party interests, right? Or this kind of conspirational logics is also very interesting to me. That also is a part of the kind of historical imagination and like locally sort of segmented forms of political subjectivity. But I mean, you know, like it's a very limiting way of understanding what is actually going on, because new actors emerge on the scene with their own agenda. Sometimes these agendas are completely improvised. You know, so this idea that this is a kind of an orchestrated effort, I don't think jives with any of the ethnographic insight that I've been able to glean over the course of the years. I mean, right now, you know, there is evidence that Pravda za Žene is actually also affiliated with some of the kind of new political parties that are emerging on the scene. I think that Pravda za Davida was really trying very, very hard not to have any kind of a political affiliation, in part because this is exactly the kind of thing that delegitimates protests in Bosnia, right? This is, you know, and in another segment of this book, I write about a politics of not yet, like what happened during the murder of Amar Mistric, you know, and how hard activists tried not to co-opt the mobilization that had emerged out of the neighborhood. You know, these were the friends of this guy who had blocked the intersection, who had then kind of, they were there for days. And, you know, all of these by then seasoned activists who had participated in these protests were really cautious and really careful, not because they were not inspired, but because they felt like there was currency in the authenticity and that grassroots thing. And this is also a part of this kind of post-war configuration where everything feels like it's artifice. You know, like international democracy promotion and civil society building really has kind of given activism a bad name. People think that this is about money laundering, like, you know, basically amassing donations. They don't see this as a kind of a authentic grassroots activist effort. So that logic of these forms of skepticism and those logics of suspicion are there. And so it's a complicated thing, right? You know, and I think that the youth in general, you know, and not just the youth, I mean, I think all people are wary and full of suspicion. And we see this also with the workers in Tuzla that we worked with. You know, there is always, you know, but the crucial thing about Dita is that they managed to overcome that in crucial moments, even though there were divisions among them, even though they suspected each other and still continue to in some sense. That, you know, there were moments when they could act as a collective, and that was in part, I think, because they had strong leadership that had a great deal of legitimacy among them, even though that was not flawless and not without contestation. So that's the question, right, of how do you create these moments? And this is the stuff that politics is about, you know, like this is the moment of consensus building is a process. And so yeah, so that would be my assessment of that. And, you know, it's you know, I guess I find it ethnographically significant also that people are really looking for authenticity in Bosnia, you know, because I think of this sense that everything is engineered in ways that are deeply alienating and inauthentic and that are not local. And one of the things I didn't get into this, but the protests were very fun as well. Like there were a lot of there was a lot of humor, there was a lot of playfulness, and the mobilizations that ensued out of them, about which I've written about elsewhere, if you want to look at, something like the interpolating the state piece from the American ethnologist, you get a sense of how much these people like loved, and myself included, because I was a part of their configuration, loved to mess with power, right? So that it wasn't just this kind of like naive, earnest love of law. There's something in excess of that.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question here? Marco, please.
Hi, Marco.
Lisa, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, okay. Finally meeting you. It's really a pleasure.
Well, in this mediated form, nice to meet you.
Yes. Okay, so
honestly, I would have loved to come to the ECA. Especially right now, in the foot of snow. Yes.
Okay, so what I wanted to say, yeah, it was really a great presentation. I really learned a lot and everything. I just have one question that you might find relevant, maybe. I really like that you really didn't start with these recent things, that you are really reminding us that there's a longer history of these protests, and that we haven't really forgot about Denis and other cases. And that's really, I think, significant, because especially now when we are talking about the current events, and very often we forget that, this happened just, maybe 13 years ago or something, and it's really relevant. And I really like that you are connecting all of these things together. But then the question that I have is, how do you articulate time in this? Because it seems to me that you emphasize continuity. I completely agree, and I really love it. But somehow, as somebody who really participated in these protests in 2014, and all sorts of protests in Mostar, because I'm from Mostar, and stuff happening after 2000 protests, I could really see the change. Like, if you had asked me in 2009, what were you doing? I would tell you, we have to do this. Like, there is hope. We can change the system. Like, we were doing all sorts of things in our faculty in Mostar. But really, after 2014 and seeing all my friends leaving the country and all these changes, I can really see that something did happen in 2014. Something somehow we almost cannot articulate. So I definitely appreciate this moment of continuity and trying to understand all this somehow together. But I'm also wondering how to address also this subtle change, but important change. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Actually, I did pivot at the end to actually make this claim that it's different, right? And I have thought very much about. So it's really interesting when you ask me about time, right? Because I know I'm all over the place, but I promise there's logic to the way that I'm going to respond to you. So when I got to Bosnia in 2008, I was amidst graduate studies and thinking that my own sort of thinking was that the issue was going to be that I won't want to come back. That this was somehow some kind of a path towards my return to Bosnia, or like I kind of it was a kind of a half-baked fantasy, but a fear that I had, right? That once I was there and living there, I would finally make that kind of move, because part of my diasporan experience has been like a desire to kind of anchor myself there, like over and over and over again. I worked very hard for that. I left when I was 14. So what shocked me, my interlocutors used to say, like, they would oscillate between telling me "Ti si naše dijete," you get it, but you don't live here, right? And therefore you don't understand. So the shocking thing that came to me in October 2009 when I was getting ready to depart, and a lot of things happened in that week. I almost burned down my house. You know, we almost got arrested. Well, some people did in fact get arrested. You know, like there was, you know, this kind of cascade of things that I was like, okay, I'm done, time to go. But what was really interesting to me is that towards the end of my field work, I started to feel the weight of the political situation and experience these visceral symptoms that my interlocutors kept talking about, the stuff that was sitting on their chest, the stuff that was making them implode, the weight of the post-war kind of uncertainty. And mind you, this was like 2009. And already then people were feeling, you know, so I started to understand that segmentation is actually a thing, that this was a kind of an affective overload. You know, and during that time, I also knew that, you know, some of my friends were like taking Valium to watch the news. I mean, which was so interesting in so many levels, but like this commitment to stay informed, and yet like the unbearability of it all, right? And so for me, that moment was also, it said something about the passage of time and kind of, again, segmentation and what it means to be fed up, right, in a kind of a visceral sense. And so I find it really interesting, right? I mean, the situation, and people kept saying like, this can't get any worse. You know, like, and yet, you know, progressively over time, things have gotten worse and worse and worse. And I remember some of my interlocutors, you know, who, like, you know, a bunch of these people who that I was affiliated with, and, you know, that I'm friends with, some of them were the leaders of the Belarusian protest, right? You know, there was a lot of continuity in terms of activist bodies and sort of persons in these mobilizations. And there was a moment in 2014 when actually something new had emerged, right? Which was an explicit articulation around issues of socioeconomic justice and dispossession that was not yet there, I think, in the same way in 2008 and even in 2013. But I mean, obviously, like a lot of continuity in terms of who was, you know, at the plenums, and, you know, and some new kind of people emerging out of this. And, you know, so you know, that's one thing to talk about. But the other thing that's interesting, I think, is that in retrospect, when I think about 2008 and 2009 and right now, I realize how hopeful this time was. Right. I mean, and it was not discernible yet, you know, to neither myself nor my activists, like the types of potential that were there, right? The effects of the global economic crisis hadn't yet hit, right? You know, there was a sense that, you know, there wasn't going to be a new war, you know, like that this peace had become kind of mature. Right. And that now the question was, like, how do we improve this? And then there was this sense of also, okay, we can't forget, you know, constitutionalne ustavne reforme, we'll just move on, right? And we will focus on the local. And so it's I wonder how in 10 years we'll be looking at this, like this moment. It makes me kind of aware of the texture of the historical time. And I think that you're right, you know, and I think that, and as I said in the concluding words, you know, there are no longer any illusions. Like at this point, this identification, this possible kind of desire for the state, I think was haunted by a different history. And today, I think that there is something else going on. And, you know, many people, you know, including myself, have made the argument that the ongoing exodus is in fact a type of protests in of itself, and sometimes like also a revocation of the types of logics that inform the protest, and a kind of a privatization of future making, like abandonment of a kind of a collective hope that things could be better. So I think I definitely think things have gotten worse. And then another thing, and I have made this argument before, is that the migrant crisis, immigration and refugee crisis, this terrible humanitarian disaster that's unfolding, is also showing Bosnians that in fact their futures are not, there's no such thing as a kind of a national future, like that's like bounded within this kind of the borders of this state. And that the types of challenges are no longer even simply national, right? This is an international crisis. And so the fact in which they experienced on the front lines, because they live on the border of the EU, which is, secure, basically like turning itself into a fortress, and so, or attempting to at least, and then, they're left with the kind of, with the violence of that policing on their borders. So I do recognize very much so that there is change, but I am, because I'm in this position of having been thinking and like observing these things for longer than some other people, to actually think about these things like historically, to go back to Elisa's point, because and all of a sudden, like, sometimes when I talk to some of my older friends, like Yasmina Husinovic, for example, in Tuzla, like, she knows so much about things that I know nothing about. Like, post-war period is so poorly documented, in terms of what was going on, in terms of reforms, and some people have like embodied lived memory of this. They haven't put it down on paper, so you have to kind of talk to them. But it's amazing, like what, like, kind of these forms of historical knowledge, how they can help make sense of what's happening right now, even when there is a profound break. So yeah, yes, and always there is both, it's like I'm a really big fan of Raymond Williams's kind of tripartite division into, like the residual, the dominant, and the emergent, like they coexist together, and then parsing them out as part of the analytical process. So definitely things are emerging. Definitely Sarajevo is a very different city today. Definitely there is a new right wing that is very different, and that is in fact, in some ways financed by external money coming out of, places like Turkey, for example. It's a very different landscape, a very, very different social landscape, and a very different generation. These folks, are kind of, I was just like looking at some of the photographs. I'm like, oh my God, I've seen them most recently in 2019, right? And I'm like, oh my God, we've all aged so much. So it's just, and I'm certainly, and a lot of them are out, like they're no longer trying to do any kind of engagement, although sometimes they show up. Like Flamenco was most recently at the protest against the Bleiburg Mass. He had a whole song and everything. He was, back to his old showmanship days. I can probably find that and share that with you. But other people are also, some have left, among the protesters, and others have turned to mountaineering, and like other types of activity that soothe the soul. So anyway.
Thank you.
I don't know if this answered anything that you, but there's just some thoughts.
Definitely, yeah, it is. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone want to come forward, or should I use my powers as the moderator to throw my own question in? Okay, I'll do that then. So a quick question, and I kind of hate bringing anything that comes up about Bosnia back to the question of nationalism. It's kind of a curse.
And yet you're going to do it anyway.
But here I go. So one of the things that really struck me was the attempt to frame the killing of Denis as an ethnic problem. By, I believe you said it was a Croatian station. And
yeah.
And this kind of brought me back to something that I came across in my own fieldwork with Istina za Vedrana, where Kurtović was a football supporter.
Yet another murder that took place during my fieldwork. Yes.
Exactly. This one in Široki Brijeg. Vedran was a supporter coming from Sarajevo and part of this Hordezla organization. And it was almost assumed that he would be Muslim, killed by a Croatian police officer, rather Croat police officer in Široki Brijeg. And it turned out he wasn't, that he was in fact part of Sarajevo's Catholic minority. Speaking with my own research participants in Bosnia who are Catholic, the ones I'm thinking of in particular, they told me, thank God he was Catholic. Because had he been Muslim, this could have been an ethnic incident. It could have been Croat kills Muslim, Herzegovinian kills Sarajevan, and it could have been framed in a completely different way. And it just was coincidental in this case that he wasn't part of the this particular, ethnic group. And again, we see this with Denis, where there was an attempt to at least frame it in a way that we seem prepared to understand in a particular way in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And everything that came out as a result of these protests could never have happened simply by the coincidence of someone being from one group or the other. I was wondering if you could possibly say something on this.
Well, I mean, I'm struck by this, thank God, right, that he wasn't, right? Because, the most horrific type of a violent act is the one that's, especially in the wake of the Bosnian War and in the wake of that violence, is the one that would have this kind of an ethnic motivation, right? Because of the potential kind of multiplication effects of such an effect, of such an event, right? And I see that as a kind of an extension of wartime logics in many ways, and the legitimate fear that many had that things like this could escalate. This was obviously this is not something, this logic hasn't disappeared, obviously, right? And people are haunted by this. So I know it's shocking to hear, but I understand where it's coming from. That kind of a claim. Thank God that he wasn't. But I think that it's really interesting as well that the types of, again, so obviously these ethnically motivated crimes were in the background of the start of the Bosnian War, like the assassination of the wedding party member, right, and all of that, right, by one of the chelas, right, who was one of these kind of semi-paramilitary leaders of a unit, in my neighborhood of all places, right? So I mean, I shouldn't say he was paramilitary, he was one of these commanders, like local commanders. I was part of this kind of loose, like the Bosnian army, right? The defense effort. And so, but I mean, that was, he had done this before, and there's a kind of complicated history to that. So I'm not surprised, right, that people would make this kind of an articulation. But once again, these events about which I'm writing about, are obviously posit that ethnic violence is not the only kind of violence, right, that exists or that matters. And I think that this is key, right? And so it was part of the shift that was articulated in 2008, and I didn't make this explicit, but the group of people that I worked with was so heterogeneous in terms of their ethnic, like there were even some people who were Jewish, which I mean is remarkable given the fact that there's so few left in Sarajevo, despite of all the Sarajevo Haggadah and all the European Jerusalem, and it was really and very kind of, when they were talking about Građani brane Sarajevo, they were holding on to that kind of a vision of a multi-ethnic space and the social that was indeed, kind of secular and in many ways, anti-nationalist and leftist, and so it's, to me, that seems like a crucial kind of a moment, and a crucial kind of point to reiterate that was a framing that was explicitly rejected very hastily by the family, by the police, because it actually wasn't, like relevant. And so in that moment, that wasn't the way that it was relevant, So I can think of, and I think that this is a kind of a zeitgeist also of the moment and of the type of community that was reconstituted through these protests, to actually insist on the fact that this was not a national cause. I think that, it's interesting to ask then, why did Vedran Puljić's mysterious murder, I don't think it's been, like, Pravda za Vedrana is still a thing, if I recall correctly. Like, I don't think it was nobody ever got to the bottom of it. Like, why didn't that moment bring people back onto the streets? I mean, this is like a real question for me then. Is it because, so many people have contempt for football fans and, see them as troublemakers? And like, is it that the moment wasn't the right one? Like, what, like, why? Like, that is really the question, given the chain of events that was happening. And I'm trying to kind of recall all these moments. There were some kinds of like marches of the football, of the fans of his club through the city, I think, but it never took off. And I think that this is an interesting question. Whereas, Denis Mrnjavac, was this like sweet, kid who was 16, who was a morally impeccable subject, right? And, his mother, who's just recently, I mean, she was posting on Facebook, friends, the memorials that are ongoing, right? There's a foundation of Denis Mrnjavac. She's spoken out quite, explicitly, and she did show up to some of the protests, but and the trial did end in conviction. But I mean, like, that's small comfort for the kind of loss that she experienced. So but there was a lot to that story as well that was really kind of powerful, and that brought people out into the street. So I don't know. I mean, that's all I can offer. But I do think that it's as powerful as the specter of nationalist violence is, right? Like you saw also during 2014, that socioeconomic dispossession and the famous graffiti called Kosi Glad Jamais Bies, like also, people remembered other kinds of violence, including structural violence. And so in part, the project of the post-war period has been to kind of return social consciousness to that idea that, enemies can be class enemies, that they're not just national enemies, and, that what's at stake is a certain kind of a political vision and not just like origins, So I guess I'll say that.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You've dedicated 2 hours to this conversation, all of you. I'm so thankful for that. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope it wasn't too much. Wow, look at you.
Look at all that applause.
Yeah, everybody's so savvy with reactions. I guess there's this one. Yeah.
Went to sleep.
What did you say?
Only the cat went to sleep.
Oh, well, the cat, then they sleep like 14 hours a day. Like, I won't be offended. And plus it's...
She was trying to get comfortable in my lap and annoying me. She finally went to sleep. There you go.
Well, who knows how cats think about these things and what interest they have in youth crime and public safety in Sarajevo. Has that cat even been to Sarajevo?
This cat is only 2. Oh. He's been to Hungary and Austria. Anyway, thank you so much. It was great.
Yes, well, thank you for showing up. and for your fantastic questions and for giving me some reassurance that this is still interesting after so long, such a long.
When do we get to read the book?
Elisa, remember what
Of course I
people did
do,
to
of
you.
course,
Yeah.
Of course I do.
Yes, yes. So, you know, but in the meantime, you should read Drew's book, which just came out.
I have it now. Thank you.
I have it too. I have not yet read it, but there you go, another idea.
Stack and your other texts are on it.
Well, anyway,
Well, the polar thing, yeah. But
yes, you can read. You can read. There's plenty to read if you so choose to do, and hopefully I'll get it done.
we just know it's going to be great. So we're
Inshallah, I have a sabbatical coming next year, so there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for your hospitality and for your great feedback.
Thank you so much. And when conditions permit, please do come to Rijeka.
I would love to come to Rijeka. I'm a fan, and my husband actually has a bunch of family there too, so it would be a perfect spot. All right, take care, and thank you for the invitation and for your attention. And please, you know, if you want to follow up, my email is right here. Sharing it here. All right, take care. Bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. It's nice to see all of you.
Likewise. Ciao.
Bye.